Here's a question that sounds insane. Why would the most sophisticated civilization in the ancient world deliberately poison their wine with one of the most toxic substances known to humanity? The Romans didn't just accidentally contaminate their wine with lead. They actively added it, refined it, and considered it essential for producing the finest vintages available to the elite. This wasn't ignorance or primitive chemistry. The Romans were master engineers who built aqueducts, concrete domes, and road systems that lasted millennia. They had advanced medical knowledge and were perfectly capable of systematic observation. Yet for centuries, they systematically added a substance we now know causes brain damage, kidney failure, and death. The story of Roman lead wine isn't just about ancient toxicology. It's about how even brilliant civilizations can create systematic blind spots that seem obvious in hindsight. And understanding why the Romans made this choice might change how you think about the technologies and practices we take for granted today. To understand why Romans added lead to wine, we first need to understand what they were actually doing. This wasn't crude contamination. It was sophisticated food technology that produced a specific, highly valued product. The Romans created something called sapa, or defrutum, a concentrated grape syrup made by boiling down wine or grape juice in lead-lined vessels. The process was precise. Wine was slowly reduced over heat until it became a thick, sweet syrup with an incredibly long shelf life. This syrup was then added back to regular wine to create sweeter, more stable vintages. But here's the crucial part. The lead wasn't just an unfortunate side effect of using lead pots. The Romans discovered that wine reduced in lead vessels tasted significantly better than wine reduced in clay or bronze containers. Lead, it turns out, chemically bonds with the bitter compounds in wine, neutralizing harsh flavors and creating a smoother, sweeter taste. Modern chemistry has confirmed what Roman vintners learned through experience. Lead acetate, formed when acidic wine reacts with lead, is incredibly sweet. So sweet that it was later called sugar of lead by medieval alchemists. The Romans had accidentally discovered one of the most effective sweetening agents in existence, centuries before they had access to refined sugar. Roman wine enhanced with sapa wasn't just sweeter, it was also more stable, lasting longer without spoiling. In an age without refrigeration or sterile bottling, this was revolutionary technology. An amphora of wine treated with lead-based sapa could remain drinkable for years, making it incredibly valuable for long-distance trade and military campaigns. The process became so refined that different concentrations of sapa were used for different purposes. A little bit sweetened and preserved ordinary wine. More concentrated versions were used almost like ancient wine concentrate, diluted as needed. What makes the Roman lead wine story so fascinating is how it reveals the sophisticated food technology of the ancient world. This wasn't primitive experimentation. It was systematic development of techniques that solved real problems. Roman winemaking faced several challenges that sapa addressed perfectly. First, ancient wines were often harsh and acidic, lacking the refined grape varieties and controlled fermentation techniques we have today. Second, wine spoilage was a constant problem in Mediterranean climates. Third, transporting wine across the empire required preservation methods that could survive weeks or months of travel. Lid-based sapa solved all these problems simultaneously. It sweetened harsh wine, acted as a preservative, and created a product that could survive long-distance transport. From a technological standpoint, it was brilliant innovation. The Romans also developed increasingly sophisticated applications. Different grades of sapa were produced for different social classes. The highest quality versions, made with the finest wines and the most carefully controlled lead reduction process, were reserved for the wealthy elite. Cheaper versions were produced for ordinary citizens and soldiers. Roman agricultural writers like Columella provided detailed instructions for producing sapa, specifying exactly how long to boil the wine, what type of lead vessels to use, and how to achieve different concentrations. These weren't random folk practices. They were documented industrial processes passed down through generations of vintners. The technology was so effective that it spread throughout the Roman world. Archaeological evidence shows lead-lined wine processing facilities from Britain to North Africa, suggesting that sapa production was a standard part of the Roman wine industry across the entire empire. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Lead-sweetened wine wasn't just a technological innovation, it was a marker of social status and cultural sophistication. The sweetest, most refined wines were exclusively available to the Roman elite, creating a system where the most toxic products were consumed by the most powerful people. Roman dinner parties were elaborate social performances, where the quality of wine served reflected the host's wealth and refinement. Serving wine enhanced with high-quality sapa demonstrated that you could afford both the expensive ingredients and the sophisticated processing techniques required to produce it. It was the ancient equivalent of serving aged French champagne, a luxury product that signaled cultural capital. This created a perverse incentive structure. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were to consume heavily lead-contaminated wine. Roman aristocrats, who could afford the finest sapa-enhanced vintages, were systematically exposing themselves to higher levels of lead poisoning than ordinary citizens who drank cheaper, less processed wine. The medical implications were compounded by Roman drinking customs. Elite Romans didn't just drink wine occasionally, they consumed it daily, often in large quantities. Roman banquets could last for hours, with multiple courses accompanied by different wines. A wealthy Roman might consume several cups of lead-enhanced wine in a single evening, multiple times per week. Roman medical writers occasionally noted symptoms that we would now recognize as lead poisoning: abdominal pain, constipation, cognitive difficulties. But they never connected these symptoms to wine consumption. Instead, they attributed such problems to various other causes, from bad air to astrological influences. The social prestige of lead-enhanced wine was so strong that it persisted for centuries, even as some Romans began to notice health problems associated with excessive wine consumption. The technology was too valuable, and the social signaling too important, for elite Romans to give up their sweetened vintages. This brings us to one of the most controversial theories in ancient history. Did lead poisoning contribute to the fall of the Roman Empire? The idea was popularized in the 1960s by geochemist Claire Patterson, who argued that chronic lead exposure from wine and other sources caused widespread cognitive decline among the Roman elite, contributing to poor decision-making that ultimately led to imperial collapse. The theory is seductive because it offers a simple, scientific explanation for one of history's greatest mysteries. Patterson pointed out that Roman aristocrats were exposed to lead not just from wine, but from water pipes, cosmetics, and food preparation. He calculated that elite Romans might have consumed lead levels far exceeding what we would consider safe today. Patterson's theory gained support from studies of Roman skeletons that showed elevated lead levels, particularly in remains from urban sites where the elite lived. Some researchers found lead concentrations in Roman bones that were 50 to 100 times higher than pre-Roman populations. The theory seemed to explain specific historical patterns. Many Roman emperors displayed erratic behavior that could be consistent with lead poisoning: paranoia, impulsive decision-making, difficulty concentrating. The gradual decline of Roman administrative efficiency might reflect widespread cognitive impairment among the governing class. But here's where the story gets complicated. Modern historians and toxicologists have raised serious questions about the lead poisoning theory. The evidence is far more ambiguous than early proponents suggested, and alternative explanations for Roman decline are probably more compelling. The biggest problem is that we don't actually know how much lead Romans were consuming. Ancient writers rarely describe their winemaking processes in enough detail to calculate actual lead concentrations. Archaeological evidence is limited and often difficult to interpret. Modern research has revealed a more nuanced picture of Roman lead exposure that complicates the simple poisoning narrative. While Romans certainly consumed more lead than we would consider safe, the actual health impacts may have been less dramatic than early theories suggested. First, Roman wine consumption patterns varied enormously. While elite Romans did drink lead-enhanced wine regularly, they also consumed large quantities of regular wine, bread, vegetables, and other foods that would have diluted the lead exposure. The total dietary lead burden may have been lower than calculations based purely on wine consumption suggested. Second, chronic low-level lead exposure produces different symptoms than acute poisoning. While Romans may have experienced some cognitive effects from lead consumption, these effects might not have been severe enough to explain major historical developments like imperial decline. Third, alternative explanations for apparent lead poisoning symptoms are readily available. Roman aristocrats faced enormous stress from political competition, military campaigns, and administrative responsibilities. They also consumed large quantities of alcohol, which can produce many of the same symptoms as lead poisoning: poor judgment, erratic behavior, and health problems. Recent studies of Roman skeletal remains have also yielded mixed results. While some Roman skeletons do show elevated lead levels, others don't. And the geographic and social patterns are more complex than simple theories would predict. Perhaps most importantly, the Romans who consumed the most lead-enhanced wine, the aristocratic elite, were often the same people who demonstrated remarkable administrative competence, military leadership, and intellectual achievement. If lead poisoning was widespread and severe, we might expect to see more obvious signs of cognitive decline in Roman literature, law, and governance. The current scientific consensus is that Romans probably did experience some negative health effects from lead exposure, but these effects were likely less dramatic and less historically significant than early theories suggested. The Roman lead wine story offers sobering parallels to our modern relationship with technology and unintended consequences. Just as Romans pursued the benefits of lead-enhanced wine while ignoring the health costs, we regularly adopt new technologies without fully understanding their long-term implications. Consider how long it took us to recognize the dangers of asbestos, despite its obvious utility for insulation and fireproofing. Or think about our ongoing debates over plastics, food additives, electromagnetic radiation from cell phones, or the environmental impacts of social media and digital technology. Like the Romans, we often face situations where new technologies provide clear, immediate benefits while creating potential risks that only become apparent over time. The Romans had good reasons for adding lead to wine. It solved real problems and provided genuine value. Our challenge is learning to balance innovation with precaution in ways that don't stifle beneficial development while protecting against serious harm. The Roman example also highlights how social status can amplify technological risks. Just as wealthy Romans consumed more lead-enhanced wine, wealthy people today often have greater exposure to new technologies and their potential risks, from experimental medical treatments to cutting-edge consumer electronics. Perhaps most importantly, the lead wine story shows how difficult it can be to recognize systematic problems when they develop gradually and provide genuine benefits. Romans didn't continue using lead because they were ignorant. They continued using it because it worked, and the negative effects were subtle enough to be attributed to other causes. Understanding why Romans added lead to their wine ultimately reveals something profound about how civilizations make technological choices. The Romans weren't victims of primitive ignorance. They were sophisticated people making rational decisions based on available information and competing priorities. Lead-enhanced wine emerged from a specific set of circumstances: Mediterranean climate challenges, ancient agricultural limitations, elite social competition, and the absence of alternative preservation and sweetening technologies. Given these constraints, adding lead to wine was actually a reasonable innovation that solved multiple problems simultaneously. The real lesson isn't that Romans were foolish, but that all technological systems involve trade-offs that may not become apparent for generations. Every innovation creates new possibilities and new risks, often in ways that are impossible to predict from the initial development. This perspective might change how we think about our own technological choices. Instead of simply asking whether new technologies work, we might ask what hidden costs they might involve, who benefits most from their adoption, and what alternatives we might be overlooking. The Romans developed lead-enhanced wine because they needed better preservation and flavor control for an important social and economic product. We develop new technologies because we need solutions to current problems. In both cases, the long-term consequences only become clear through experience, often after the technologies have become deeply embedded in social and economic systems. So, why did the Romans add lead to their wine? Because it worked. It solved real problems, provided genuine benefits, and became so integrated into Roman social and economic life that abandoning it would have required giving up significant advantages with no clear alternatives. The Romans weren't systematically poisoning themselves out of ignorance. They were making sophisticated technological choices based on available information, competing priorities, and complex social pressures. The fact that these choices had unintended negative consequences doesn't make them irrational, just human. The lead wine story reminds us that every technological innovation involves risks and benefits that may not become clear for generations. The Romans pursued the immediate advantages of better wine preservation and enhanced flavor, while remaining largely unaware of the long-term health costs. We face similar challenges today with technologies ranging from artificial intelligence to genetic engineering to social media platforms. Perhaps the most important lesson from Roman lead wine is that technological wisdom requires not just innovation, but also humility about the limits of our current knowledge and careful attention to unintended consequences. The Romans were brilliant engineers and administrators, but they couldn't predict the health impacts of their winemaking innovations. Neither can we fully predict the long-term implications of our technological choices. The best we can do is remain aware that every innovation involves trade-offs, pay attention to emerging evidence of unintended consequences, and maintain the flexibility to change course when new information becomes available. The next time you hear about a new technology that promises to solve current problems, remember the Romans and their lead-enhanced wine. Innovation always involves benefits and risks, and the full implications often only become clear through time, experience, and the kind of historical perspective that allows us to see patterns that weren't visible to people living through them.